The dust of redemption, Wyoming, tastes of grit and finality. It coats Clara's worn traveling dress, settles in the lines of her face, and makes a home in her throat. The man standing before her on the train platform is carved from the same hard earth. His name is Elias Thorne, and his letter, written in a stark, functional script, had promised a new life. Looking at him now, at the grim set of his jaw and the hollowness in his eyes, she feels less like a bride and more like a parcel he has been forced to collect. He is taller than she imagined, broader in the shoulder, but the space he occupies seems vacant, as if the man himself is somewhere far away. Miss Miller. His voice is low, rough, like stone scraping stone. It's Mrs. Thorne now, I suppose, she replies, the words feeling foreign and flimsy in the vast, open air. He gives a curt nod, his gaze flicking over her as if assessing livestock. There is no warmth, no welcome. He takes her single, battered valise and turns toward a buckboard wagon without another word. The silence on the ride out of town is a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides, broken only by the plodding of the horse and the creak of the wagon wheels. She watches the sparse, clapboard buildings of redemption shrink behind them, replaced by an endless expanse of sagebrush and sky. This is her new world, wide, empty, and crushingly quiet. She is an island in a sea of his silence, a place she has traveled 1,000 miles to be, only to find she is utterly, completely unwanted. When the wagon finally crests a ridge, she sees it. A small, bleak cabin hunkered down against the wind, with a thread of smoke rising from its chimney like a final, fading breath. And in the window, a small face, pale and still as a porcelain doll's, watches them approach. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. Clara's life, and his, were now irrevocably entwined in the silent observation of a child. This was not a new beginning. It was a continuation of an ending she had yet to understand. The inside of the cabin was clean but achingly sparse. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a bed in one corner, and a smaller cot tucked into another. Everything was scrubbed and orderly, yet it felt unlived in, as if its occupants were merely passing through. The little girl, who Elias had introduced as Lily with the same detached tone he'd used to name his horse, had vanished from the window and now stood half-hidden behind her father's leg. She was tiny for her age, which Elias's letter had stated was 5, with enormous, dark eyes that held the sorrow of an old woman. She did not speak. She simply watched Clara with an unnerving stillness. "This will be your room," Elias said, gesturing to a small, curtained-off alcove that contained a narrow bed and a wooden crate for her things. He placed her valise on the floor. It was clear from the arrangement that this was to be a marriage in name only, a transaction of labor for lodging. The sting of it was sharp, but Clara pushed it down. She was an orphan from a teeming Philadelphia tenement. She knew the cold mechanics of survival. Romance had been a foolish, fleeting hope, but belonging, that was a need as essential as bread. "The well is out back. The chores are what you'd expect," he finished lamely, already turning away. "See to the girl." It was a command, not a request. With that, he took a worn hat from a peg by the door and left, the silence rushing back in to fill the space he'd occupied. Clara stood alone in the center of the room, the unspoken history of the place pressing down on her. A faded patch on the wall suggested a picture once hung there. A set of smaller, neatly stacked logs by the fire hinted at a woman's touch, now absent. And then there was Lily, a silent, ghost-like sentinel of a life that had existed before her. Clara unpacked her few belongings, 2 spare dresses, a brush, and a small, leather-bound book of poems her mother had loved. She placed the book on the crate, a tiny anchor of her past in this vast, uncertain present. She was a stranger here, an intruder. She knew that. Her first task was not to be a wife, but to prove she was not a threat. She turned her attention to the child. "Hello, Lily," she said, her voice soft. "My name is Clara." The girl didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed, her small face a mask of inscrutable grief. Clara didn't press. Instead, she tied on the apron she'd packed and set about learning the geography of her new kitchen. She found flour, salt pork, and dried beans. Simple fare. As she worked, kneading dough for bread, she began to hum, a low, tuneless melody her mother used to sing while doing laundry. It was a sound of quiet industry, a gentle pushing back against the oppressive silence. Lily, from her post by the door, watched and listened. The first few weeks passed in a silent, grueling routine. Elias would rise before dawn and work until well after dusk, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, and trying to coax life from the unforgiving soil. He ate what Clara cooked without comment, his face a permanent mask of exhaustion and preoccupation. They exchanged only necessary words about supplies or weather. Clara learned he was a widower, that his wife, Sarah, had been taken by fever the previous winter. A simple, unmarked wooden cross on a hill overlooking the cabin told the rest of the story. She was living in a home built for another woman, caring for a child who was not hers, and married to a man whose heart was buried on that hill. Her one trip into redemption with Elias for supplies was an exercise in quiet humiliation. The townsfolk stared. Women in crisp calico dresses paused their conversations to whisper behind their hands, their eyes flicking from Elias's grim face to Clara's plain one. At the mercantile, the proprietor's wife, a woman with a pursed, judgmental mouth, offered condolences to Elias for his loss while barely acknowledging Clara's presence. "It's a hard thing, a child needing a mother's care," the woman had said, her tone dripping with a pity that felt more like condemnation. Clara felt her face burn, the brand of replacement searing itself onto her skin. She was not a person. She was a solution to a problem, and an inadequate one at that. Clara's focus narrowed to the one part of this world she felt she might be able to reach: Lily. The child was her shadow, following her from room to room, watching her hang laundry, churn butter, and patch Elias's worn shirts. She never spoke, never smiled. Clara talked to her anyway, narrating her day in a gentle, one-sided conversation. "Now we'll mend this tear in your papa's sleeve. He must have caught it on a wire. I think these potatoes will be lovely for supper, don't you?" She never asked questions that required an answer, simply filling the space with her voice. One afternoon, while cleaning, Clara found a small rag doll stuffed under Lily's cot. It was grimy, and one of its button eyes was missing. A small, sad thing. That evening, by the light of the fire, Clara carefully washed the doll's dress. She found a spare button in her sewing kit, a dark blue one, not a match for the remaining black one, but a fine eye nonetheless. She restitched a loose arm and used a bit of red thread to give the doll a simple smile. When she was done, she placed it on Lily's pillow. The next morning, the doll was gone. Clara's heart sank, thinking the child had rejected the offering. But later that day, she saw Lily sitting on the porch steps, clutching the mended doll tightly in her small arms. It was the first sign, the barest crack in the wall of silence. A month after her arrival, a late spring storm blew in, a ferocious gale that rattled the cabin's very bones. Elias was out, having ridden to the far pasture to check on a newborn calf. As the sky turned a bruised purple and rain lashed against the windows, the wind found a loose board in the roof. A leak started, dripping steadily onto the floor, then a second one, this one directly over Lily's cot. Lily, who had been sitting by the hearth, looked up at the drip, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed too big for her small body. Clara acted without thinking. She scooped the child into her arms, cot blanket and all, and carried her to her own narrow bed in the alcove. "It's all right," Clara murmured, tucking the blanket around her. "We'll be snug as bugs in here." Thunder cracked overhead, and Lily flinched, burying her face in Clara's side. Clara wrapped an arm around her, her hand resting on the child's trembling back. She started to hum her mother's lullaby, her voice a low, steady anchor in the raging storm. She sat there for hours, a silent child clinging to her, the sound of the rain and her own soft humming filling the small space. When Elias finally returned, soaked to the bone and weary, he stopped dead in the doorway. The fire cast a warm glow on the scene in the alcove, his wife, the stranger, holding his daughter, who was not trembling anymore, but sleeping peacefully in her arms. He saw the buckets placed to catch the drips, the dry wood stacked neatly by the fire, the pot of stew warming on the hearth. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't vacant. It was filled with a complex mixture of exhaustion, surprise, and something else she couldn't name. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture that held more weight than any words he'd spoken to her. He stripped off his wet coat and sat at the table, and for the first time, they shared a late supper in a silence that felt not empty, but companionable. The fragile truce forged in the storm began to slowly, cautiously, grow. Elias started speaking to her more, asking about her day or commenting on the weather. He told her which of the chickens was the best layer and showed her how to properly bank the fire at night. They were small, practical things, but they were threads of connection. Clara, in turn, learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, to know when to offer him a cup of coffee and when to leave him to his thoughts. She watched him with Lily. She saw the profound, helpless love he had for his daughter and the deep, abiding grief that kept him from truly reaching her. He would try, his large, calloused hands looking clumsy as he attempted to braid Lily's hair, his voice strained when he tried to read to her from a worn primer. The child would accept his attentions with her usual passivity, but the wall remained. One Sunday, he announced they were going to the service in town. Clara dreaded it, but she put on her best dress and braided Lily's hair, tying it with a bit of ribbon she'd saved. In town, the expected whispers and stares followed them. After the service, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, descended upon them with a look of cloying sympathy. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, her eyes sweeping over Clara critically. "So glad to see you all. And how is dear, poor little Lily faring?" Such a sudden change for a sensitive child. The insinuation was as sharp as a needle. Clara was the change, the disruption, the cause of continued sensitivity. Before Clara could form a reply, Elias stepped slightly in front of her. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried a new authority. "My wife is doing just fine, Mrs. Gable. And so is my daughter." He put a hand on the small of Clara's back, a brief, protective gesture, and guided her toward the wagon. He had called her his wife. Not just on paper, not just for convenience, but as a defense. He had stood with her. The ride home was silent again, but this time, it was a silence filled with unspoken meaning. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a dangerous, fragile tendril of hope. She was beginning to care for this broken man, to see the goodness buried beneath his grief. She was no longer just surviving. She was building something here, something she was becoming terrified of losing. Summer settled over the high plains, hot and dry. The work was relentless, but a rhythm formed. The three of them became a unit, moving through the days in a quiet choreography of shared tasks. Elias would work the land, Clara would work the home, and Lily would watch them both, the silent center of their small universe. One evening, Elias came in from the fields carrying a handful of wildflowers, clumsy and bright. He didn't say anything, just set them in a jar of water on the table. But Clara knew they were for her. The turning point came with the first chill of autumn. Lily woke one morning with a flushed face and a dry, rasping cough. By midday, she was burning with fever. A familiar, cold dread washed over Elias's face, the same look he must have worn when Sarah fell ill. "It's just a chill," he said, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to deny. But it wasn't. By nightfall, Lily was delirious, muttering incomprehensibly, her small body slick with sweat. The doctor was in a town a full day's ride away. Panic seized Elias. He paced the small cabin, his hands clenching and unclenching, his grief making him helpless. He was terrified of losing someone else he loved. Clara, however, became a bastion of calm. She had seen fevers like this sweep through the tenements back home. She knew the delicate dance between life and death. "Elias," she said, her voice firm and clear, cutting through his haze of fear. "I need cool water from the well, and more wood for the fire. Keep it low and steady. Go." He stared at her for a second, then nodded and moved to obey, grateful for the direction. While he was gone, Clara bathed Lily's forehead with a damp cloth. She remembered her mother using willow bark for fevers. She found some Elias had stored for his own aches and pains, brewed a bitter tea, and patiently forced tiny spoonfuls between Lily's parched lips. All through the long night, she sat by the cot, never leaving the child's side. She murmured soothing words, changed the compresses, and held Lily's small hand. Elias worked as she directed, a silent, grim-faced assistant. He watched her, his initial panic giving way to a sense of awe. He saw not a mail-order bride, not a stranger, but a woman of incredible strength and deep, unwavering compassion. She was fighting for his daughter with a ferocity he hadn't known she possessed. Toward dawn, the crisis passed. The fever broke. Lily's breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep. The air in the cabin, thick with fear for hours, suddenly felt light again. Elias sagged into a chair at the table, burying his face in his hands. The relief was so profound it was physically painful. He looked up at Clara, who was still sitting by the cot, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear. In that moment, he saw her. He truly saw her for the first time, beyond the shadow of his loss, beyond his own guilt. He saw Clara, the woman who had filled his silent house with quiet care, the woman who had just saved his child. A few days later, Lily was sitting up in a chair by the hearth, pale but recovering. Clara knelt before her, gently brushing the tangles from her fine hair, humming her soft, familiar lullaby. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was a moment of profound peace. Elias came inside, closing the door softly behind him. He had been outside for a long time, standing on the hill. He walked over to them, his boots silent on the wooden floor. An emotional precipice loomed between them, a chasm of things unsaid. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and find the words to thank her, to tell her what she had come to mean to this broken home. But before he could utter a sound, another voice filled the space. It was small, rusty from disuse, but perfectly clear. Lily, who had not spoken a single word in almost a year, looked up at the woman tending to her so gently. Her dark eyes, no longer clouded with sorrow, were full of a child's simple, aching need. She reached out a small, weak hand and laid it on Clara's cheek. "Will you be my mommy now?" The question hung in the quiet air, fragile and powerful, a prayer whispered into the stillness. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the small, earnest face before her. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a wave of emotion so overwhelming it stole her voice. She pulled the little girl into her arms, holding her tightly, burying her face in her soft hair. Elias watched, and the final, stubborn wall of grief around his heart crumbled into dust. He wasn't betraying Sarah's memory. He was honoring the life they had created by allowing it to flourish again. He knelt beside them, his knees cracking on the floorboards, and placed his large, calloused hand over Clara's, which was resting on Lily's back. Their three hands, joined together. A family. He looked at Clara, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. Her name, when he finally spoke it, was no longer a formality. It was a belonging. "Clara," he said, his voice thick and rough with emotion. "Thank you." It was all he could manage, but it was everything. In that quiet moment, the unwanted bride, the grieving rancher, and the silent child ceased to be separate, lonely islands. They became a single shore, bound together by hardship, healed by compassion, and given a future by a child's whispered question. The transaction was over. A life, together, had just begun. A few weeks later, the crisp autumn air held the promise of winter, but for the first time, the cabin felt ready for it. It was no longer a house of ghosts, but a home filled with the sound of life. Elias stood by the corral, watching as Clara patiently showed Lily how to feed the chickens. The little girl, who now chattered endlessly, scattered the grain with delight, her laughter a bright, clear sound that carried on the wind. It was a sound Elias thought he would never hear again. Clara looked up and caught his eye. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that made his heart ache in a way he was slowly learning to embrace. Lily ran over to her, triumphantly placing a brightly colored autumn leaf in her hair like a crown. He watched his wife laugh, her head tilted back in the afternoon sun. He had sent a letter east out of desperation, seeking a pair of hands to help carry his burden. He hadn't understood then what he knew now, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. By some grace he felt he'd never earn, he hadn't just been sent a wife. He'd been sent the rest of his life. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They survived hardship and found a new beginning. What are you hoping for them next? Share in the comments.